I'm very honored to be asked and deeply indebted to you and Ravi and other mutual friends. Ravi told me that previous speakers have included 4 Nobel Prize winners. I'm really sorry I can't match their quality. And I'm probably here under other false pretenses as well. Because I think Ravi and others were worried that only 2 or 3 people would come to the talk. So in the advance posters, they very cunningly displayed the picture of my namesake, a much better looking, younger, and hugely successful businessman, also called Shyam Bhatia, a passionate sponsor of international cricket who happens to live in Dubai. So I'm sorry if this turns out to be a disappointing evening for some. I know nothing about business. I'm only a humble reporter. And my apologies as well to Shyamji in Dubai for impersonating him. I thought maybe start by talking a little bit about Ukraine. It's on everyone's minds today. And reporting Ukraine illustrates the significance of a relatively new catchphrase, HEFAT, H-E-F-A-T, which stands for Hostile Environment and First Aid Training, sometimes abbreviated to HEAT, that reporters and camera crews are now required to undertake before they accept frontline assignments. So typical 4-day courses cost about £1,200 and are supervised by former soldiers. HEFAT did not exist in my time, but today is very much in evidence among media teams covering Russia's ongoing attacks in Ukraine. As you all know, heavy fighting has been raging in multiple Ukrainian cities, where 5 journalists, Oksana Bolina, Pierre Zakruski, Alexandra Kushniova, Brent Reno, and Evgeny Sakun, were all killed in the first month of the invasion. The European Broadcasters Union, by the way, is also running a safety course that costs £3,000. It would be easy to be wise after the event, but I wonder if HEFAT could have saved my friend and colleague Tom Walker from the Sunday Times in London, who was convinced that the cancer he contracted and eventually killed him came from the radiation emitted by depleted uranium ammunition deployed by NATO forces in Kosovo. These depleted uranium explosives are more effective in penetrating heavy armor, as Tom was repeatedly told while covering the Balkans in the late 90s. He died in 2007, aged 44. Depleted uranium is also cheap, effective, and long-lasting. Fragments absorbed by the body are carcinogenic, and the radiation effects are endless. NATO and US forces used depleted uranium in Kosovo, then in Syria, Iraq, more recently in Afghanistan. Russia has admitted equipping its T-80 tanks in Ukraine with depleted uranium shells. Not all of the sites where depleted uranium is used have been cleaned up, and hospitals in the Basra area of Iraq, for example, report much, much higher rates of cancer among pregnant women and their babies. So inevitably, insurance rates for media coverage in these war zones have rocketed. I don't know if Marie Colvin, also the Sunday Times, received any HEFAT training, and if so, whether it would have helped save her life during the coverage of the siege of the city of Homs in Syria back in 2012. She was only 56 years old. HEFAT was certainly not available for one of her husbands, the Bolivian journalist Juan Carlos Gumuchio, who committed suicide by shooting himself in the head back in 2002. There are many, many other foreign correspondents and war reporters from the recent past who were killed in the course of their reporting assignments. One of them was Sunday Times Middle East correspondent David Holden. He was ambushed in his hire car and killed just outside Cairo airport. Another colleague from the Sunday Telegraph, a man called David Blundy, was shot and killed by a sniper in El Salvador. By comparison with such brave and courageous colleagues, I really am one of the lucky ones. At the age of 73, I'm still alive and able to talk about my experiences. And fortunately, perhaps in this day and age, I should say harishk, it hasn't been all gloom and doom. Vivid memories still exist of what happened, for example, in the city of Alexandria back in 1980, when a local Egyptian waiter convinced me he discovered the tomb of Alexander the Great. This local expert, so-called, employed as a waiter at the once grand Cecil Hotel, which had previously hosted the likes of Winston Churchill, Agatha Christie, and Gerald Durrell. That's where he was working. Yeah, that's the Cecil Hotel. We were having breakfast one morning at this hotel, and this waiter convinced me that all he needed was $100 to hire a power drill to penetrate the paving that would uncover the entrance to the tomb. So I duly hired the power drill, and we started our excavation just outside this hotel on one of Alexandria's busiest streets, a bit like MG Road here in Bangalore, until the police arrived and arrested us. When the police chief questioned me, I pointed to the waiter and said he'd promised me the scoop of a lifetime by revealing the entrance to Alexander's tomb. The police chief burst out laughing before telling me I'd been conned by a well-known local lunatic. Equally amusing in retrospect was my experience of covering the US invasion of Iraq in 2003. The invasion lasted for only about a month, but after it ended, I happened to help diffuse a looming crisis between a US Army captain who was besieged by a desperate mob of helpless, unarmed Iraqi civilians who were all looking at him and shouting, "Moya, Moya." Moya is the Arabic word for water, and as I speak Arabic, I was able to instantly translate the key word and reassure this blonde US-born American officer who only spoke and understood English and who was, fingering his machine gun, thinking he's about to be attacked. As tensions cooled, and by way of a return favor, he said he would take me into Saddam Hussein's palace, where he wanted to express Uncle Sam's gratitude in a more meaningful way. First, he offered to give me one of Saddam's confiscated personal cars, including a Rolls Royce. Then he tried gifting me a solid gold machine gun, one of 22,000 gold and silver machine guns that the Americans had apparently liberated. When I told him I couldn't get any machine gun past customs at Heathrow Airport in London, he replied, "Don't worry, we'll melt it down for you and they'll never know. But you'll end up a rich man." Sorry. Oh, where have I gone? Yeah. Do you see it was actually a gold pistol and a gold Kalashnikov. Needless to say, I said no, thank you. Elsewhere in the world, in Sri Lanka, the army officer who arrested me for trying to report the Tamil uprising in the north of the country was absolutely obsessed with trying to find out if I was Hindu, Christian, or Muslim. Instead of asking me directly about my religious faith, he took me off for a sumptuous meal of salads, plus chicken, beef, and pork dishes. As you know, most Hindus avoid beef and Muslims refuse pork. So by watching what I ate, he thought he would have cast iron proof of my religious faith. To this day, I have no idea why it mattered. I got off very easily because, first of all, I ate all of them. And then, after interrogating me, he had me deported. No harm done. Marie Colvin of the Sunday Times, on the other hand, who was sent to cover the same conflict, but 1 decade later, lost an eye when she was caught in a battle between government forces and rebels. Most of us come into this media way of life because most of us feel compelled to tell the truth about momentous events. And inevitably, some of us are romantics. So many of us are misled by the flattering propaganda of those academics who tell us how journalists are the ones writing the first draft of history. The true reality is that a lot of us simply follow the instructions of news editors who point us in the direction of good stories and the need to have them covered. Even today, very few of us consider in detail the possible knock-on physical and mental effects of the assignments we are given. So today, I thought it might be quite useful to talk about a few of the more challenging stories I covered and how they affected both my colleagues and me. I thought maybe of starting today's talk in a way by looking back to Afghanistan 1980 because of the obvious parallels with today's crisis in Ukraine. Then as now, Moscow denied invading a sovereign independent country. Then as now, Moscow denied sending any troops across an international border. Back then, in Afghanistan, the story we all craved was something that provided cast iron proof of Russian soldiers crossing the border. Now that scoop was earned by Robert Fisk of the Times, who traveled to the Salang Pass in the direction of the Tajik border, where he met and interviewed a Russian colonel in full uniform. This Russian officer's question to Fisk was, "Are the Beatles still alive?" The story, as you can imagine, was an international sensation and was played out on the front page of the Times. Those who questioned the credibility of Fisk's story were told to get off their haunches out of our comfortable Kabul hotels and see for ourselves firsthand what was happening in the rest of Afghanistan. So this is a picture, a more recent picture of the Salang Pass. It used to be packed with explosives, and the only way to get from one end to the other was like a narrow sort of pathway on the edge, and you had to make sure you went along that pathway, didn't fall into the pit of explosives that was in the rest of the pass. Anyway, going back to Fisk, I took his word, and I thought, I should be ashamed of myself. Here I am, being jealous of other reporters and their wonderful stories. And I took a taxi to the bus station in central Kabul and boarded the first bus leaving for the city of Kandahar, where Russian troops were rumored to be gathering. Now, 2 hours out of Kabul in this rickety old bus, we were suddenly ambushed by anti-Russian rebels. They were the kind of predecessors of the Taliban, a ragtag bunch of lightly armed local peasants who had some elementary training in the use of arms. They were totally educated, and they took huge pleasure in torture and killing. Their aim was to identify and kill any Russian sympathizers who were identified by the red ID cards, red for communism, that they carried. These red cards were the equivalent of our Aadhaar cards. All my 40 or so co-passengers, a mix of adult men and women, carried these ID cards. And as I watched in horror, the Mujahideen shot them in the head, one by one. What saved me was my blue British passport. So after they had piled up the bodies of the others and set fire to our bus, these Mujahideen rebels forced me to run with them across the frozen countryside, sheltering first in one village and then another. At the first village, I'm sorry to say, they stripped me naked, hung me upside down, and beat me about the head with their Kalashnikovs. Later, they confiscated my passport, stole my radio, and $3,000 in cash. By the time they lost interest in me, I was a wreck, running a temperature, speculating about what kind of funeral to expect. A kind village elder, very nice man, he's about 80 years old, helped me by taking me to the main highway, where I was able to flag down a passing Russian T-72 tank. The Russian officer in charge of this tank was an English-speaking captain. He gave me a cup of coffee, then he stopped a passing civilian bus that took me to Kandahar. From there, after another series of adventures, I managed to borrow some money, get on a civilian aircraft of Ariana Afghan Airlines that flew to Kabul, Once I was back in Kabul at the hotel where I had booked in and where I still had a room, the security police came barging up to my room before arresting and deporting me to Delhi. There was no counseling available at that time. It was, by today's standards, very primitive, the kind of help we could expect. No counseling about how to deal with the trauma of being held hostage. And then it may surprise you, added to that was an enormous sense of shame. It would be different now, of course, but at that time it was unthinkable to phone up my editor in London to say, I've been brutalized by a gang of Afghans, please can you help me? So in these circumstances, it was amateur psychology of mine that came into play. Rightly or wrongly, I convinced myself that in order to confront those Afghan demons, it was important to return to the country. And I did. It's a bit like, when you're taught to swim and you drown the first time, not drown, but your head goes underwater and your uncle says, do it again, you'll survive. It was that kind of idea, thinking in my mind. Go back, you've got to confront it. So the first occasion when I went back was to write about a Russian military base in a place called Urgun, and then to the outskirts of Kabul. And finally, when the Americans invaded in 2001, they invaded to topple the Taliban government and search for Osama bin Laden. I went right into the heart of Kabul itself. It was on that trip that I was befriended by the late Tom Walker of the Sunday Times. We crossed the Oxus River together from Tajikistan and then shared a makeshift flat in Kabul, where he told me his stories that I told you about the depleted uranium ammunition to which he had been exposed in the Balkans. Afghanistan was, of course, just one of many regional conflicts I covered during more than 20 years of working for The Observer. The others were the Iran-Iraq War, the invasion of Kuwait, the civil war in Sudan, Morocco's war with Western Sahara, and the Israeli invasion of Lebanon. Each one was different, and they all affected me in different ways. I thought it would be useful to talk about some of them because of what they reveal about the nature of conflict and the impact on the media. Before being posted full-time to Cairo and then Jerusalem, The Observer sent me on lengthy reporting assignments to Africa, to Angola, Zimbabwe, Kenya, Mozambique, and finally Sudan. It was Sudan that most interested our editor because of the civil war and the numerous human rights violations. Those human rights violations started with an army general called Ahmed al-Bashir, who later became self-appointed president, who ousted the democratically elected government of Saeed al-Mahdi in 1989, then held on to power for the next 30 years. Stories of human rights abuses started almost immediately as Bashir and his predominantly Arab Muslim supporters tried to hold on to the oil-rich and gold-rich African South. It was Bashir who licensed the creation of Islamic punishment villages, and this is where young African boys had their hands and legs lopped off for minor offenses. I mean, if someone had stolen a pen, off went your hand. If they'd stolen a bottle of Coke, you lost a leg, that kind of thing. And so you went to these villages and you saw these handicapped children, also adults. I mean, it was really heartbreaking. You wanted to cry. There's nothing you could do, and they were helpless victims. Just as bad as these cutting of hands and legs were what they called branding camps in a place called Shendi. Now, Shendi is 300 kilometers north of Khartoum, and that's where enslaved African women from southern Sudan showed me the scars on their thighs when they were tortured by red-hot metal horseshoes, or else they had beta signs and signs of 8 put on their ears. So to get a better understanding of this particular conflict, Observer photographer Roger Hutchings and I flew to Nairobi and then made this really fantastic trip from Nairobi past Lake Rudolph over from the Kenya border into southern Sudan. Our aim was to interview the southern Sudan leader, John Garang, and we teamed up at that time with a company called Thames Television. It's no longer functioning, but it was prominent TV company, and traveled in convoy for 3 nights and days before finally getting to see Garang in his isolated headquarters deep in the kind of Sudanese jungle. Disaster struck on our way back towards the Kenya border. We were in 2 Land Rovers. Roger, the photographer, and I were in front. Thames TV was in the back. And as we stopped by the mud road for a rest and a drink, the Thames TV producer, a man called Alan Stewart, asked me if we could swap seats. Now, Alan was a tall man, very tall, about 6'4", 6'5", and was finding it extremely uncomfortable in his Land Rover. So we swapped and continued driving. 5 minutes later, I heard a muffled boom. I turned around and saw that Alan's Land Rover had exploded after driving over a mine that we miraculously missed. Alan himself was blown into the air and came down with a thin branch of a tree running right through his head. For the next 15 hours, while someone else went for help, we nursed him as best we could. His end came early in the evening when his head was on my lap. There was a sudden vomit of blood and he's gone. None of us coped, but the person in the media group who suffered most was photographer Roger Hutchings. He went into shock, and after we returned to London, he lost about 4 stone in weight in 6 weeks. He was in such a bad way that our editor, Donald Trelford, called me into his office and said, "What can we do to help him?" And again, at that time, there's no professional help available in London, so once again, using my on-the-spot amateur psychology, I asked if we could be sent on yet another demanding foreign mission. And quite by chance, that same week, we happened to be interacting in London with a small delegation of refugees from the Western Sahara. These refugees were known as Sahrawis. They were trying to fight for independence from Morocco, and they wanted journalists to provide eyewitness accounts of what it was like on the ground as they resisted Moroccan forces. So with the blessing of the editor, Roger and I arranged to visit the Sahrawi headquarters in a place called Tindouf in the northwest Sahara. First we flew to Algiers, then the two of us with some, traveled by jeep to Tindouf. So far, so good. The following day, the Sahrawis took us to see a Moroccan military base, 20 miles from Tindouf. It was a nighttime expedition that involved climbing a small hill to look at the base before climbing down again. The only trouble was that our young guide forgot the safe way back. So halfway down this hill, he said, "We're now in the middle of a minefield, and you'll have to crawl on your hands and knees for 3 to 4 hours to avoid the butterfly mines planted by the Moroccans." So we looked at him in horror, and he said, "Don't worry, they're only small mines. You'll only lose an arm or a leg." By the time we got to the safety of the road early morning, both of us were drenched in sweat, with Roger blaming and cursing me, swearing he would never speak to me again. However, the shock tactics worked. He actually recovered later on, put on weight, and we remained fast friends to this day. So I want to show you what happens on our way back. Getting a free shave from one of our guides on our way back to Algiers in the middle of the Sahara Desert. After Africa, the Observer posted me first to Cairo, then to Jerusalem, to cover the 2 major running stories of the time. The first was the endless conflict between Jews and Arabs, and to understand and report that fight, I needed access to leaders of both communities. The Israeli Jews were easier to access. I had met Menachem Begin briefly in Cairo, and through him managed to access the then Prime Minister Yitzhak Shamir. Shamir himself was a former member of the Irgun, which is the British call them a terrorist group, and he was blamed by the British for the famous 1946 attack on the King David Hotel in Jerusalem, as well as the murder of Lord Moyne, who was then the British resident minister in the Middle East, as well as the murder of UN mediator at that time, a man called Count Folk Bernadotte. When I met and interviewed him twice, Shamir, to me, didn't come across as a reformed terrorist, much more as a sort of dignified gentleman with terrible memories of the Holocaust when the Jews had been slaughtered by the Nazis. For 2 hours, he talked almost non-stop about how he grew up in Belarus and the Second World War concentration camps in Poland. So this is me with Shamir. Next picture, please. On the other side of the divide, of the Israeli-Arab divide, there was PLO chairman Yasser Arafat, which I'm sure you're all familiar with whom I'm sure you're all familiar. And he, again, until 1988, was almost impossible to access. And in my case, probably because I wasn't important enough. He was more interested in the New York Times, Washington Post, and so on. But this changed with the help of a Swedish colleague, a woman who was also an Auschwitz survivor, a woman called Cordelia Edwardson. We were both great friends, and we were both reporting a PLO meeting in Algiers in 88. And Cordelia had somehow managed to gain access to Arafat. When she'd finished interviewing him, she came out of his room, pushed me inside, and then stood outside the room with her hands like this, daring any Arab guard to physically move her. So her intervention was the start of a very good working relationship with Arafat. And when I met him on several occasions later on, I always took with me a large jar of honey, something he always accepted, because what Palestinian community leaders told me in Jerusalem was that he loved honey, and it was something to keep him sweet. When I gave Arafat that first jar of honey in Tunisia, I also took the liberty of asking if he'd recently married, and that too, to a Christian. He was seemingly furious at such a personal question, immediately canceled the interview and threw me out. So I thought, well, bad luck, it was a well-meant question, but in my Tunis hotel, I was packing my bags and preparing to return to Jerusalem when there was a knock on the door. Outside there were these 2 hefty Palestinian guards, just grabbed me by the shoulders, pushed me into a car and took me to Arafat's house, where I suddenly found I was invited to a lunch for 3 with Arafat and his new wife, Suha. And when I asked him why he'd been so angry, he just smiled and said, "Can't you take a joke?" It was the start of a long-standing association that never died, regardless of what I wrote about him. When he moved to Gaza from Tunis, I would often visit him to talk about the peace negotiations. And on one memorable occasion, I remember, Suha Arafat said she was running late and could I take charge of her baby. So there I was, Middle East correspondent of The Observer, suited and booted, tie, for the next half hour, wheeling a pram along Gaza's seafront with the Arafat baby inside and 6 guards behind me. On one occasion, when tensions between Jews and Arabs were especially high, I happened to be visiting Gaza, and Suha Arafat asked if I might take a note from her to the wife of the Israeli Prime Minister, Leah Rabin. I did. I was reluctant to, but I did, and it was my sole attempt at political matchmaking. I don't know if it helped because, Rabin himself was killed only a few weeks later. The other great stories of the time were the Iran-Iraq War, Iran's Islamic Revolution, and the hopes and ambitions of Iraqi President Saddam Hussein. Each story was worthy of several books. My focus was on the Iran-Iraq War, and Saddam in particular, who was being egged on by the West to take on the mullahs of Tehran. That particular war ended in stalemate. But while fighting Iran, Saddam also took on any challenge to himself from within his own country. Among those challenges were the Kurds, the Iraqi Kurds. And one afternoon in March 1988, the Iraqi Air Force dropped mustard gas and the chemical agent tabun on the Kurdish town of Halabja. An Iranian Air Force helicopter flew a small group of us, foreign reporters, from Tehran to see for ourselves what had happened in Halabja. En route, one of the Iranian pilots asked if I'd like some self-injecting medication, big sort of syringe, something that looked as it was filled with iodine, and something I refused. We were 5,000 feet up in the air, and even now, the thought of that often makes me feel faint. As it was, the bodies of about 5,000 men, women, and children had all turned blue by the time we landed in Halabja, and we were only allowed to stay for 1 hour before being whisked back across the border. After Halabja, Iraq for me remained a constant challenge. For me, it was personally important for a collection of complex reasons. For a start, Saddam, personally ordered the execution of a friend and freelance journalist, Farzad Bazoft, who was arrested at Baghdad International Airport, charged with being a spy and then hanged. That year was 1990. Farzad himself had contributed extensively to the Observer and was 31 years old when his execution was ordered. Then there was the constant mystery of how far Saddam had got with his nuclear weapons ambitions. Thanks to my Indian contact, Dr. Raja Ramanna, who personally supervised the development of our own nuclear program, I was introduced to a selection of his Iraqi friends and colleagues in exile. It was Ramanna, the nearest I've ever had to a guru, who told me he'd been a VIP guest invited to Iraq, where Saddam summoned him to his office and told him face to face, "Name the price. I'll pay you anything. Just get me the bomb." One of Ramanna's own contacts was an Iraqi nuclear chemist, very high up in the hierarchy, a man called Hussein Sharistani, who was tortured for refusing to participate in nuclear bomb making. You see here Hussein's picture there. After Saddam's fall, Sharistani personally took me on a guided tour of southern Iraq before taking up his new job as a minister in the post-Saddam government. While he was in exile in Iran, where I used to visit him often, Sharistani briefed me about where Saddam had reached in his quest for the nuclear bomb. Thanks to him, I was also introduced to the team of UN nuclear inspectors entrusted with dismantling Saddam's nuclear infrastructure, brick by brick. Some of their thoughts are incorporated in one of the books I subsequently co-authored with a British colleague. That book is called Brighter Than the Baghdad Sun, and it's a play on the words of Robert Oppenheimer, who responded to the July 16, 1945 US nuclear bomb test at Los Alamos. Oppenheimer, citing the Gita, characterized the 1945 first nuclear test in the following words: "If the radiance of 1,000 suns were to burst at once into the sky, that would be like the splendor of the mighty one. Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." And finally, there was the continuing tragic saga of Saddam's human rights violations in other parts of his country. Apart from the Kurds in places like Halabja, he had his eyes on a historic community called the Marsh Arabs, living in a triangle of land north of Basra, sandwiched between the Tigris and the Euphrates. Now, romantics say this is the site of the original Garden of Eden. Others say this is where the wheel and writing were invented. Not far away is the biblical city of Ur, birthplace of Abraham. The Arab families who lived in this area had always been there for generations and were always resentful of central rule. Saddam was enraged that what was for him was an obscure community daring to challenge him. So he started a steady campaign of bombing, plus digging a canal to dry the area and make it infertile after 5,000 years. Getting to the marshes is not easy, but my nuclear chemist friend Hussein Sharistani helped with his contacts, and somehow they managed to smuggle me across the border from Iran. We first flew to a place called Ahvaz in southern Iran, where Arabs happened to be the dominant ethnic group, and from there, accompanied by a group of 3 locals, we made our way to the marshes, traveling by foot, sometimes walking, sometimes running, and dressed in light cotton clothes, like a kind of Arab version of kurta pajamas, evading Iraqi army patrols and taking shelter with local families. This was a most spectacular trip about which I still have dreams. Lush green fields, clean water pools, fringed by untapped spills of oil bubbling to the surface. I lived and ate with local families, living in their reed huts, unchanged from 5,000 years. Most importantly, I was able to gather and document hard information about how Saddam was trying to bomb this historic area into submission. Still fresh in my memory is the experience of going fishing with one of the sons of one local family. One of those boys shot and plucked a wild duck, then took out its liver, roasted it over fire, and offered it to me as a speciality. It was this family that repeatedly pleaded me not to return to the West, offering me all sorts of inducements, including daily lessons to improve my Arabic and the choice of a bride if I converted to Islam. I still haven't found a home for the 30 to 40 minute footage that I filmed at the time. I want to show you some of the pictures of those marsh Arabs. If you wouldn't mind just scrolling through them, just to give you a sense of that community and how I lived and worked with that. Please, next one. And the next. And the next. And the next. I think that's the last of the marsh Arabs, is it? Yeah. Iraq still haunts me, really haunts me. And you've probably guessed, I somehow fell in love with it and all its people, from Kerbala to Baghdad and Babylon, all the way south to Basra. When Saddam was eventually toppled, I secured a visa and was allowed back in officially to spend a month in Baghdad. Subsequently, in 2008, I returned to see British Army squaddies manning some of the checkpoints in Baghdad. They're very friendly and helpful. The big shock was engaging with fellow reporters from Fleet Street. One of them, a woman, was dressed in what looked like a sort of very fluffy snowman suit. She also had 2 British bodyguards watching her every move. When I asked her how she could function, she said this was all part of her HIFAT training and the price that now had to be paid for embedded reporting from behind British lines. As I continued looking at her, she elaborated. She said, our company, that's the BBC, will not send us abroad without insurance, and no insurance will give us cover without bodyguards. So one last footnote, if you like, a postscript. More than 10 years after I left the region for good, I was traveling by road to visit my in-laws in the English county of Hampshire. By sheer chance, it was my wife Amanda, not me, who happened to be driving the car, and I was a backseat driver, a backseat passenger, playing noughts and crosses with my young sons. All I remember is a slight tickle above my right eye, then loss of consciousness caused by a seizure. In the years to come, it happened again and again. Finally, medical specialists in London speculated that these epileptic seizures could be linked to the traumas suffered in Afghanistan, Sudan, and the Western Sahara. No one knows for sure, but thanks to these specialists and their prescribed medication, I have, unlike so many of my colleagues, managed to survive. Thank you.
Shyam, it's been a fantastic telling of your, all your episodes of history, and didn't expect you to have been a friend of the Israelis and the Palestinians. That's quite shocking. Why don't you tell us about Benazir? Your best friend, please. Love to know how you met her. Love to know the escapades that you two, had together. That would be interesting.
I'll tell you the last story before I go into all that. I'd gone to visit her in Dubai, and her son Bilal, who's now Pakistan's foreign minister, was standing, a lot of Tamiz and Tehzeeb. We stood outside to get me in, and Benazir said, I'm worried about that boy. So I said, why? We used to call her Pinky. Her pet name was Pinky. I said, why, Pinky? What's the matter? She said, he wants to be a ballet dancer. So I started laughing. I said, so what? She said, come on, she said. Pakistan's a conservative Islamic country. Imagine if he goes back and says to the mullahs, I want to be a ballet dancer. What future does he have? but to answer your question in more detail, so she and I became friends. We were in Oxford together. And I was leading a demonstration against Zulfikar Ali Bhutto being given an honorary degree. And she came hammering up to my room, went like that. She said, don't you dare demonstrate against my father's honorary degree. And I said to Benazir, half in Urdu, half in English, I said, Benazir, dekho, I'm not a gentleman. Tum mujhe marogi, main tujhe wapas marunga. And she then left, but then I got a very nice letter of apology from her, and I was invited to see her, and we became very friendly. But I also knew her brother Murtaza. And Murtaza and I shared the same tutor. I was doing my PhD thesis on India's nuclear program. Murtaza was doing his thesis on Pakistan's nuclear program. We used to meet each other in the corridors, the same tutor. And then when I went into full-time media reporting, I happened to be in Damascus. And we were sitting in the Damascus Sheraton. In those days, Western hostages used to be kidnapped in Lebanon, then released in Syria. So we were all there for one hostage release. And this tall chap swaggers into our bar, dressed in a red waistcoat, and looks, like this at us. And I said, Murtaza? And he took out a gun. He said, who wants to know? I said, Pagal ho gaye tum? Oh, Shyam, sorry. So I was really scared, Nina. I went up to my room. He came hammering after me, knocked on the door. Come down. Come and have a drink. I'm really sorry. I didn't realize. I have to be so careful. So we went down, and one drink followed after another. Then he said to me, this was 1988. He said, because I'm the man, only men rule Pakistan. So I said, are you telling me this on the record, or is this a private conversation? No, he said, this is on the record. And I had the foresight to think, well, if I write this down, I must have a witness. There's a friend of mine who worked for the Daily Express. He was there. I said, Danny, will you come and sit in on this conversation I'm having with Murtaza Bhutto? And we published the story. 2 weeks later, we get a letter from a lawyer. $10 million libel. But I had the witness, so I was protected. And the witness, my friend Danny, wrote to the lawyer saying, I'm willing to get up in court and testify that what Shyam reported was accurate. Then I met Murtaza a few years later. I said, what is the matter with you? You told me yourself. Are yaar, can't you take a joke? $10 million joke. Benazir, Pinky wanted to know what he'd said to me. And I was besieged by messages. I was going all over the world. I used to get these messages. Shyam, I want to know exactly what Murtaza said about me. So finally, she was back in London. And I bumped into her and I said, Pinky, you want to know what he said, but I'm too shy to tell you. But there's one condition. I will tell you. If you answer all my questions on the record. She said, okay, come to Dubai. I'll tell you anything you want to know. But you must tell me what he said. So I flew to Dubai and took out my tape recorder, not making any mistakes this time. And I said, okay. And I told her what he'd said. She said, now ask me what you want to know. So I said, my speciality is nuclear weaponry. Tell me, did you really collaborate with Korea in giving them nuclear enrichment technology? She said, yes. She said, we wanted their no-dong missiles. They wanted our enrichment technology. So I flew out with A.Q. Khan to Pyongyang, and we did the exchange, and they gave us a sample of their long no-dong missile. And she said we loaded it onto the undercarriage of the wing of my aircraft. We flew back with it. Anyway, she talked to me for about 4.5 hours on the record. Then she said, now you have to make me a promise. Never publish this while I'm alive. Hey, dost thi, main kya karun? So I said, okay, you've asked me, I'll make you the promise. When she died, a publisher got hold of me and said, you've got to write this story, write the book. So I wrote a book called Goodbye Shehzadi. And to this day, it's not safe for me to go back to Pakistan. I had demonstrators outside my house for, about 4 days, saying, Shyam Bhatia, Murdabad. I went to see the Pakistani High Commissioner. I said, look, can't you do something? And he said, it's a free country, people can do what they want. So I said, High Commissioner, there's one thing I want to tell you. everything Benazir told me is on the record, but I only published 70% in the book. If those demonstrators aren't moved by tomorrow, I'll publish the other 30%. Do you know they all disappeared? So, there you go. Long story.
Shyam, my name is Ajit Akte. I'm a retired Air Force fighter pilot and an airline pilot. I just wanted to know, use of depleted uranium weapons, do they technically qualify as nuclear weapons?
No.
No, they don't.
No, they don't.
But the after effects are as bad as...
Massive. And there's a kind of cover-up. No one wants to talk about that. And everyone says, give us proof. All you have is anecdotal evidence from, the death of my friend Tom Walker.
Yep.
And some American soldiers saying that they've been affected and all kinds of side effects. But for some reason, it's too expensive for them to get rid of the depleted uranium. The Russians, of course, won't admit to anything. But the Americans have been pursued, and they won't talk about it.
You crossed over from Iran into Iraq during the Iran-Iraq war.
Yes.
I was in Iraq from 79 to 81 when the war actually began. So we were in Tikrit. We were part of the Indian Air Force training team, training the Indian Iraqi Air Force.
My goodness. But Tikrit is up, that's the birthplace of Saddam.
That's Saddam Hussein's birthplace. He's Saddam Hussein al-Tikriti.
Yeah, of course. Yes, I remember.
Hi, thank you for that talk. I have two questions.
Please.
The first one is, what motivates you, to choose the profession or the line that you did, not just being a journalist, but putting yourself in such dangerous situations? Is it because, you think of world peace, or is it because you're very patriotic, or you're crazy? Three things. And the second question is, how do you earn the trust of, opposing world leaders? You mentioned you were close to both the Palestinian leader as well as the Israeli leader. Is it because you're a journalist and so your voice matters? Or is it because of something in your personality and your authenticity that they seem to trust in, I'd really, really love to know.
So your first half of your question is what motivates me. I think I never wanted to be a journalist. I wanted to be an academic. And I think because my very first story was published in the Times in London, and the editor invited me out to lunch and said, what are you going to do? And I said, I'm going to be hopefully one day a professor. He said, rubbish. You'll be a very good journalist, and I'm going to sponsor you for the Times training scheme. So the sheer excitement and being flattered like that led me into journalism. And then I think it was the excitement of the job. And we foreign correspondents, I hate to say it, we were a very kind of elite group, moving across countries, across borders, our own masters. And one story led to another. It's very difficult to break out of that kind of rhythm. And I don't think I really wanted to until it became very difficult. You ask how I was able to move between Palestinians and Israelis. I'll surprise you with my answer. I think it's because I was an Indian. I was a disinterested party. I wasn't a Jew, I wasn't an American, I wasn't a Brit. I was slightly more sympathetic to the Palestinians, long associations with India and Yasser Arafat. But I also had a lot of sympathy for the Jews who died in the concentration camps, and talked to them like that about these are parallel nationalisms. If you don't take sides and you see them as parallel nationalisms, you're respected for that. And I try to write my stories in the same way. I didn't hide back from covering one side or the other.
Where are you based now? Are you still working?
Occasionally I do the odd story. I do the odd story every now and then. I don't know if you saw the thing in the Times last month about Rishi Sunak. You saw that. The editor's is an old friend. And then by chance I don't know if you know about Show Me Das. Do you know about that? So another British paper rang me up, because I now write for pleasure more than anything else. And I'd been tipped off that Shomi Das, who'd been headmaster of Sanawar, Mayo and Doon, had been a personal tutor of the then Prince Charles, now King Charles. And I got hold of his number. I remember I rang him in Hyderabad. I said, Shomi, is it true that you taught Prince Charles? So he said, yes. And I said, can I talk to you about that? It's one of the British papers here wants to know. So he told me the following story, that he was science master at Gordonston, where Charles was a pupil. And one day he was looking over his shoulder, and it was Prince Philip who came into the room, and Prince Philip said, well, they called him Daz, like that powder, that washing. Well, Mr. Daz, is there something we can do for you? And he said, well, sir, actually, we need a telescope. And he said, in 2 weeks, brand wonderful big telescope arrived, and I installed it. The next day, Charles came into the classroom, and he said, Mr. Daz, that's just like the telescope I have in Buckingham Palace in my bedroom. It was great fun writing that story. And he told me that he kept in touch with the royal family. When Philip came to Jaipur, when he was headmaster of Mayo, the Maharaja of Jaipur was on the governing body of Mayo. And so the Maharaja invited him to a duck shoot. They all went hunting in those days. So they shot duck. Afterwards, there's this big dinner. They all had too much to drink, so Shomi tells me. And then there was this big billiards table. And Prince Philip, who was there, said, well, let's play billiards. And Shomi said, well, I don't know how to play billiards. He said, don't worry, we'll improvise. We'll throw billiard balls at each other. So he said, for 2 hours, we'll throw it. Anyway, they loved the story. And there was the India connection and so on, which was well appreciated.
Mr. Bhatia, my name is Anuhita. I'm a journalist as well. And I think in more recent years, there's been quite a lot of debate about the addictions of war reporting.
Yeah.
And you also just now said how it was perhaps difficult to get off once you're going from one place to the other, but the majority of the things you've recounted are from conflict zones. I'm wondering about your perceptions on that. And I had another question, but maybe later.
Well, there's no question you get a high, as I'm sure you appreciate as a fellow journalist, if you have a good story published and you get the front page, for example, and your name up there. It's wonderful for the ego. And then the downs are when a lot of us started drinking. I mean, I know I used to drink probably a lot more than was reasonable. Some of my colleagues took to drugs. Cocaine was a favorite, and that was often a killer. I didn't know about heroin, but I know about alcohol and cocaine. And that helped to sustain a lot of colleagues in difficult times. I know Marie Colvin of the Sunday Times, they couldn't sack her because she'd lost an eye in Sri Lanka. And she came back and used to drink a lot. Now, in those circumstances, an editor would be justified by saying, enough is enough, please. There's the door. But because she had suffered in the cause of the service of the newspaper, no one dared to take her on. But she was so addicted. I mean, someone like her who'd been exposed to so much danger, losing one eye, elected on her own to go to Syria, where she eventually died. And it's a really tragic story. She's a very, very good journalist, very, very fine person.
But did you feel you could do non-conflict reporting at any point?
It never really entered my mind, because when I came back to London, the Observer made me their diplomatic editor. And frankly, it was extremely boring. Going to the foreign ministry, asking for briefings, then from one boring embassy party to another, this kind of inane chatter of this excellency said that and that excellency said that. And I thought, what do you know? You haven't been at the sharp end of the business. And it was hard, very, very hard to adjust to. And I was extremely lucky because one of the newspapers here, Deccan Herald, used to occasionally reprint some of my articles. And the editor at the time rang me up and said, I hear you're free. do you want to go to Washington for us? So I spent a couple of years as the Deccan Herald's Washington correspondent, and also concurrently their foreign editor at that time. They could afford to do it, and the circulation of the paper was a lot more than it is now. But that was great fun, working for a different newspaper, a daily newspaper. It was the nearest there was to being a foreign correspondent. It's a long-winded answer, but the answer is it's very difficult to adjust. I couldn't really get back to social reporting. I couldn't write about communities, for example, or welfare projects. I mean, I could, but it was painful.
Is there a trade in depleted uranium? And if there is, who controls that trade? That's question number one. Question number two, in the course of your career, did you have opportunities to meet spy masters in the countries where you were reporting? One spy master who's sitting on my left, we can exclude from this. Anybody else, and what you thought of them?
That's a very, very interesting question. People like us who are on the front line were targeted by foreign intelligence agencies for various reasons. So one reason was to act as couriers. I mean, you had to resist working for them for obvious reasons, because you exposed yourself to additional danger. It's also pretty dishonorable. You represent your newspaper, not the intelligence agency, another government. So one was to act as messengers. The other one was to share information with them, which sometimes you did innocently, because let's say you'd been to, Baalbek in Lebanon, and you were sitting in a bar. You don't know if that person's a diplomat or an intelligence agent. You're babbling away saying, guess what I saw? And they pick that up. But where it got really nasty was, I remember in Lebanon, I talked about Baalbek, there used to be a man called Terry Waite. Any of you remember him? He was the Archbishop of Canterbury's envoy, sent to Lebanon to try and free Western hostages. And then he himself was kidnapped. And it was an international sensation at the time. What has happened to Terry Waite, the personal envoy of the Archbishop of Canterbury? So I was at the British Embassy one day, and the consular said to me, Terry Waite is dead. I said, how do you know? He said, I've been briefed by the, whatever the Lebanese intelligence agency was called. And he said, not only is he dead, I know where he's buried. He's buried in the city of Baalbek. Now, to get to Baalbek, you had to cross a dividing line. There was West Beirut, which was Arab and Muslim, East Beirut, which is where we were, Christian, and that's where all the embassies were. I thought it was a great story. So very foolishly, I crossed the border, arduous journey, went all the way up to Baalbek, and looked around, talked to people, and said, rubbish, no one's been buried over here. And came back, again, great danger. Rang the editor of the paper. He said, there's no story, there's no dead body, what are you calling me about? And I went to see this fellow at the embassy, and I said, it's not true. Oh, he said, I'm glad to hear it. Tell me about your journey. He was using me to test what had happened along the road. And he didn't care what happened to me. And then, there was a great, great pal of mine who took a lot of interest in my nuclear stories, an American, young American. Very helpful. I remember I was tipped off by him accidentally. We read Arabic together at the university in Cairo. And he was often a guest at our dinner parties. And one day, we had a dinner party for 12 people. He was the 12th, but at the last minute he said, no, I can't come, I'm busy. The list for those who were invited had been prepared by my secretary. And the next day after the dinner party, well, let me go back. He said he wasn't coming, but in the end he turned up after midnight, unexpectedly, saying, oh, I changed my mind. But his name wasn't on the list because he said he wasn't coming. So in the morning, my secretary said, sir, the secret police are after me. They want to know who came to to your dinner party? So I said, no secret, give them the list. So she gave them the list. She said, they say you're a very clever man. You left out the name of the American who arrived later on. Now this chap, he's still alive. I saw him occasionally here and there. And about 5 years ago, he came through London. And I said, what are you doing now? Because he worked for this company and that charity, etc. He said, I've just stepped down as the National Security Advisor for the Far East, which is, I suppose, another word for CIA, would it be? National NSA Advisor for the Far East, based in Singapore. So the Egyptians had been right all along. He was actually working for the Americans. And there are many, many stories like that. Some which I won't go into, but I remember one very funny one. There was a Yugoslav colleague, great friend of mine called Miro, and he worked for Tanjug, which was a Yugoslav news agency. And we played tennis together, we used to drink together, all that. And in the early 2000s, I think, the Observer wanted to send me to the Balkans. I didn't want to go to Kosovo. And by that time, you were asking me, how is it easier to get off that circle of war reporting? I just had enough. I was sick of it. But the Observer was very persistent. You must go to Kosovo. You must go to Kosovo. It's your professional duty to go where you're ordered to go. And I always had my suspicions about Miro. I thought, well, East Europe, he's a bit too friendly, and although we were, great pals, I thought he probably works for the security service. So I rang him up in Belgrade. I said, Miro, this is Shyam here. Look, they're trying to send me to Kosovo. Can you block my visa? Just like that. And the foreign editor called me. He said, Shyam, I don't know. All our journalists go in and out of Kosovo. Yours is the only one they've blocked. So there were great advantages sometimes. You ask about the trade in depleted uranium. To be honest, I don't know. But again, Miro was a source for, we were talking about nuclear weaponry and how the trade in nuclear weaponry. And he said, no problem. He said, if you want, I can buy you a nuclear mine. I'll get it for you, Russian-made, nuclear mine. It'll cost you $50. Tell me, I'll have it delivered to your doorstep. But I never took him up on it.
There's a question here.
Shyam, I'm Puneet Surana, and I have a very simple question. How do you decide whom to trust?
Sorry?
How do you decide whom to trust?
Oh. It's a very, very difficult question. If you've been in the region long enough, in those days they used to post us for long times. We outlasted the diplomats. So I was in the Middle East for 10 continuous years. Used to go back and forth to London twice a year, paid for. But when you've been in the region, you get a sort of feel for it. And you can't always know. You have to go by instinct. I mean, usually in the embassies, it's the defense attaches or, people like that who are associated with intelligence. People who might shoot you, you don't know. So it's, you're not trained to spot the ones that you can trust or not trust. Unfortunately, it has to be by instinct and instinct alone that tells you which person is reliable and decent and isn't going to sell you down the river or exploit you in some horrible way. But it doesn't always work out that way, and that's a chance. There's a chance you've got to take.
And do you have a black flag or something to know when to stop the trust?
Do you look for black flags to know when to stop to trust somebody? If yes, what are they?
I suppose someone asks too many of the same questions, or someone who gets a bit too familiar that you don't know. Now, this American I was telling you about, the way he inserted himself into my confidence was we lived, my wife and I and my young son, we lived in a 3-bedroom flat in Cairo. And my American friend, with whom I'd read Arabic, so no reason not to trust him, used to turn up. My son was, I think, 3 years old. He'd say, "Oh, I'll take him on a motorbike ride through Cairo." So Rupert, my son, would cling on to him and off they'd go. So you kind of learn to trust someone like that. He never got anything out of me, except I suppose he knew I had access to the nuclear programs of Egypt. I had easy access there, at one point to Iraq and even Israel. So it was very, I wasn't really aware of providing information, but dinner table gossip, say, "Oh, guess what, the other day I saw X person, he's a PhD from Harvard and he's a trained nuclear chemist, and guess what he told me about X, Y, and Z." So unwittingly I was passing on information, but he never actually said, "Can you tell me?" But it was enough for him just to pick up those scraps. And I never thought that he was working for the CIA. It's only much, much later. So there were no black flags. He won my confidence in such a clever way by, taking my young son, strapping him onto his back and going around on his motorbike. I suppose the only black flag would be too many questions of the same sort and too much effort to ingratiate yourself in someone's company.
Shyam, do war correspondents enjoy any form of immunity?
No, not really.
And
and again, it's a good reason to steer away from anyone who might or might not be representing a foreign intelligence agency, because once you're branded, I have to tell you a story. Once you're branded as a spy, not only do you endanger yourself, but you endanger your colleagues. And I'd like to relate the story of Iran. So I was in Iran one time trying to cross over into Azerbaijan, which is a neighboring country to the north, hanging around the border trying to see if I could get over without a visa. And this group of guards stopped me and said, "Jasoos, jasoos." But how do you prove you're not a jasoos? So they said, British passport, British jasoos. So I said, no, I'm not a jasoos. Prove it. And I just didn't know what to do. So I thought I remembered from my childhood this song, "Mera juta hai Japani, meri pant Englistani, sir par topi lal, lekin dil hai Hindustani." And they roared with laughter. They all knew this song and said, "You're normal, okay. We let you go."
Hi Shyam, Lakshmi here. Were there any stories where you had to toe the line of a particular editor over the years because of a story that had just broken or a popular narrative?
Sorry, toe the line in what way?
Color the story that you were covering in a certain narrative that was wanted by an editor.
Yeah, it's a 50-50 divide. The safest thing was to toe the line. Accept what was given to you and maybe, put in a bit of color. But the really good stories are when you went off track. If you didn't toe the line, you were in danger, inevitably. So, a lot of people thought, well, I've got this foreign assignment, I have my foreign allowances, my house is paid for, I have a car paid for, and so long as I, produce, X number of stories a day or a week, or whatever it was, I'll be okay. So 50-50 divide.
What if you saw something differently, let's say, what is the problem of that?
If you saw something differently from your colleague and you published it, well, you were hated for it. It's a short answer. How dare he break out of the mold? Who does he think he is? Why isn't he following the consensus? But then again, you have to make a choice. Do you want to be yourself or do you want to follow the crowd? Again, it's an instant decision you make. at the time. I was very lucky. I had the support of my wife, who's as bloody-minded as I was. And not only did she put up with all my long absences, she always said that I should, do my own thing and be my own man. And I have to give her full credit. I really don't think I'd be here standing today talking to all of you if I hadn't enjoyed that kind of full-throated psychological and emotional support from her, both at a personal level and professionally. Because she would read often, obviously, what I wrote. And she'd sometimes question me and say, are you sure you got that right? So they're helpful.
Sir, you had mentioned that one of our top nuclear scientists was in Iraq.
Yeah.
And that there was some interaction. Were we kind of India helping Iraq to develop nuclear weapons?
No, we never did. But relations between Saddam and Mrs. Gandhi were very good, as you probably know, and relations therefore between Iraq and India. And Saddam openly wanted help to develop the nuclear bomb. So Mrs. Gandhi, to her credit, never agreed. But as a way of keeping off her back, she sent Raja Ramanna to Baghdad. And Raja, who, by the way, his son is called Shyam, same as me. Raja said to me that he went there not quite sure what to expect, and Saddam was in his office, and he just said to him, Dr. Ramanna, we want the bomb. Name your price. We'll pay you as many millions of dollars as you want. You can have it delivered in a Swiss account, in your personal account in India, in London, anywhere you want. And as you know, if you knew Raja, very urbane, very sophisticated man, apart from being a prize-winning world scientist, simply said to him, I'm sorry, Your Excellency, but I'm not in the habit of trading nuclear weapons expertise with anyone. You'll have to ask my government.
I'm Janki, and I'm one of the editors Shyam worked with. And every time, he had an off-site story that she said, and he would just alert me, and we would carry it the same day or the next day. I don't know. So I don't think. So, quite often he had, I would badger him with editorials that I wanted the next day, and he would send it to me the next day too.
That's kind of you to say.
Yeah.
Hi, this is Nimisha. So nowadays we have the concept of work-life balance, or just switching off your work when you go back home. So in a profession like yours, where it's very difficult to maintain, that's what I'm assuming. So how do you maintain your, the identity, like yourself, when you are alone or when you come back home after you have seen everything out there in the world, even when you were a bachelor or when you were in a family? How were you a father to your son or a husband to your wife when you knew everything and your mind was not, just not alone with all the thoughts?
Yeah, very, very interesting, very relevant question. I'd like to answer that by saying I don't know what my colleagues did, because it was not just my dilemma. Sorry, I don't know what my colleagues did, because it wasn't just my own dilemma. It was a dilemma shared by so many of my colleagues. So many of them took to drink in a way to evade that particular issue, or to drugs in a few cases. In my case, I think, and I'm not saying it just because I'm here in Bangalore, I really think it was my Indian roots. Wherever I was, I never forgot that I was an Indian. I thought a lot about my parents. I thought about growing up in Delhi. I remembered the occasional thappad that I got from my mother. And I remember in Afghanistan, For example, you talk about how do you maintain yourself. When I was delirious and I'd been, badly beaten, and I was kind of wandering about on the road, and one of the things I was thinking was, what on earth will happen if I die? These bloody Afghans will have me buried. But I'm a Hindu, I want to be cremated. How are they going to cremate me in the middle of godless Afghanistan? It was that kind of thing. So really my childhood is what sustained me, memories of my childhood. And as I mentioned to you before, I have a very loyal and supportive English wife who's put up with all kinds of escapades, including one where we happened to be, when I was blown up in the Sudan, and the Observer editor rang her up, and he said, Mrs. Bhatia, this is Donald Trelford. I'm sorry that your husband is dead. I wonder what we can do to support you. Because I think Reuters had carried a story saying journalists had been killed. Amanda was pregnant with 7 months pregnant with our first child. And she was absolutely hysterical and thought she might lose the baby. But fortunately, 2 hours later, information came through that although we had indeed been blown up, and yes, a journalist had been killed, but it wasn't me. So I don't know if that answers your question.
One last question here.
Sure.
Dr. Bhatia, may I refer to you as Dr. Bhatia?
Oh, thank you. President would do.
Thank you so much for a very engaging and engrossing talk. You talked about childhood a couple of times. I'm curious to know about the run-up to your PhD. How did you get to that PhD program? What was your planned career path? Of course, we know how you flipped to being a journalist. That's one question.
Yeah.
Am I allowed the B part? After all of this, what's your take on war as a mechanism for global peace?
Oof, it's a very difficult question. How did I end up researching the Indian nuclear program? It's very straightforward. I was very good at liberal arts at boarding school in Dehradun, but the one science subject that always intrigued me was physics. And our physics teacher had a big board outside his classroom where he would note whenever a nuclear test was carried out. And for some reason, that kind of stayed with me and entranced me. And when I was doing my undergraduate degree in England, the one subject in which I particularly excelled was defense studies and the nuclear programs of other countries. So when I graduated, my tutor at the time said, why don't you do a PhD? Go up to Oxford. I'll recommend you to go there. And since I was from India and since I was interested in our own program, it was it wasn't easy, but we hadn't tested in 1974. So access to the Bhabha Atomic Research Laboratory was relatively easy. And if you have time, I'll tell you an anecdote about that. Okay. So the editor of the Times of India in Bombay in those days, so I'm talking about 1972, was a man called Kumud Khanna. And Kumud said to me, if you want real sort of hard information about what's going on in Trombay, you should meet the lady friend of Homi Bhabha. Homi himself was dead, but he had a Parsi girlfriend, a very nice woman called Pipsi Wadia. And I was introduced by Kumud to Pipsi. She lived in Malabar Hill apartment. And I remember I saw a lot of her with her permission. And she used to say things like, Shyam, darling, you'll never understand the era I grew up in. Homi would ring me up, and he'd say, Pipsi, darling, would you like to see the opera in Vienna this evening? And do you know We would be on an Air India plane, first class, no visa required, and in Vienna that evening, and the opera was on for us. So after a lot of these stories of how she and Baba used to buzz off, you know how difficult it was to leave the country in those days. But Baba was a kind of VVIP, so visas, etc., wasn't a problem. So one day I said to her, I said, Pepsi, have you kept any of the original documentation that Homie had? You know, drawings of Trombay, how he saw the reactor developing. And she had this whole suitcase full. And despite being a very wealthy woman in her own right, it was all packed together in a suitcase under her bed. So one day she said to me, if you want to see some of these drawings, come over and I'll show them to you. So I went and I was leafing through them. You know, there was Homie, by the way, was a very gifted artist in his own right. So he'd done a lot of sketches, which for people like me were very interesting. So I was going through all this, and she said, I think, you know, for the sake of fairness, I think you should go and see his brother. Now, I've forgotten Baba's brother's name. He's a particularly unpleasant man. He was a director of Tata's. And just say to him that I've got this documentation, and does he mind that I'm showing it to you? So I went to see the brother, and he was furious. Who is that? Who is that woman? What does she think she is? How dare she show you these documents? I went back to see Pepsi the next day, and she was kind of, you know, tear-streaked. And she said, I wish I hadn't told you, because some of the brother's heavies turned up, barged into my apartment, demanded the suitcase, and dragged it off. So again, I went back to the brother. I said, look, I'm sorry if there's been a misunderstanding. Pepsi asked me as a courtesy to come and see you because you're the living member of his family. You know, she was only Baba's friend, and she thought it was right and proper that I ask you. And he said, tell her from me, I've burnt all the documents. Now, I don't know if it's true or not, because I know some of the documents are still in Trombay, and some of them probably are classified. I don't know. But I was denied access. I don't think, to answer the second part of your question, that wars are a way of resolving conflict. I think there's a clear divide between cultures. I've become very conservative in my old age. You know, I look at what I call the white Neanderthal cultures. I think they're by instinct aggressive. They're by instinct destructive. And I look at our own, I mean, we are far from perfect as Indians. But I don't think think of the anti-sea cries, perhaps that's contradicts what I'm going to say. But I think by and large we're not instinctively destructive. I think it does boil down to different values, cultures. If you look at one of the works I'm doing, I suppose I'll tell you why I'm saying all this. My next book, which I hope will be out next year, is about colonial atrocities. So one of the things I've got access to are pictures held at Cambridge University. They have a South Asia Research Center. And they have pictures from 1942 of entire villages in Bihar, East Bengal, and what is today Mizoram, where the Allies razed entire villages to the ground, leaving not a single house standing. And these people all made homeless, some were killed. And the justification was, it's the Second World War, we can do what we want. You know, the larger objective is the defeat of the Japanese and the Germans. I mean, the sort of questions I ask in London are, well, what on earth did we in India have to do with your European war? Okay, maybe Japan. I mean, Gandhi said, talk peacefully to the Japanese. I don't believe that they would have helped us. But anyway, Japan is a different question. What did we have to do with what happened between Germany, France, and the United Kingdom? We were dragged into it, as we were in the First World War. By the way, First World War, did you know that India gifted, quote unquote, £1 million to the Allied effort without our permission? So that's when I say the instinct for destruction is greater in some cultures than others. Sorry if that sounds so aggressive.
And with that, we come to an end to this session. Shyam Bhatia, thank you for this rare and insightful talk.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you for coming.